Good evening. Welcome to the Saturday Gala Readings of the 2004 Montana Festival of the Book. I am Mark Scheraus, Executive Director of the Montana Committee for the Humanities, which sponsors this event, and through our grants and other programs, many other events like it throughout our state. The Montana Festival of the Book would not be possible without the assistance of numerous individuals and organizations. I would like to thank the more than 80 writers and panelists who appeared at this year's festival. Many have traveled great distances. All of them are here for their commitment to their craft and to their readers, and we sincerely appreciate their support for the festival. Foremost among the organizations that support us are, of course, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Montana Arts Council, the Paul G. Allen Family Foundations, the Charles Engelhard Foundation, and of course the Missoulian. Many other local individuals, merchants, and organizations listed on this evening's program support the festival in a variety of ways, and to them we also offer our thanks. And lastly, we thank readers like you who support the festival with your generous donations. We will thank you ever more if you make just one more stop by the donation box in the lobby this evening. I want to thank also the staff of the Montana Committee for the Humanities, Yvonne Gritzner and Gail Walton, and above all, our festival coordinator, Kim Anderson, for their great work in putting the festival together and keeping it running. Susan Carlson and Judy Klein help us immensely with the festival every year, and I'm grateful for their dedication and their hard work as well. A number of our wonderful volunteers do important work with the festival, and they also have our gratitude. One in particular, a fixture at this event the past 4 years, is not with us tonight, but I hope it's not too late to thank Bruce Lee, who supported so much Missoula and Montana culture. We remember you, Bruce. I have the honor of announcing tonight also the winner of this year's Happy Tales Literary Contest. The contest asks writers to supply happy endings to works in need of them. And in the past 4 years, we have worked diligently to improve on the writings of William Shakespeare, Ernest Hemingway, Norman Maclean, and Larry Watson. The winner receives both a modest stipend and the Nahum Tate Cup. Nahum Tate, as you all surely know, was the 18th century poet laureate who rewrote King Lear, and whose happy ending to the play was the version performed in the British Isles for the next 150 years. For 2004, the winner of the coveted, prestigious Nahum Tate Cup, drum roll please. That's good. It's Mr. Gordon Jameson of Albuquerque, New Mexico. For his imaginative, prize-winning parody of Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. We'll have it up on the web in a few days. I need to thank also this year's contest judges, Professor Michael Sexton of Montana State University, and writer John Jackson of Missoula. And speaking of John Jackson, I want to convey also my appreciation to him and to photographer Tony Cesara for this year's Montana Festival of the Book poster. Tony's a great photographer, John is a great writer, and also a great sport. Among other announcements tonight, I have to tell you that you're on television, or you will be. Cable 7 is here filming this event. And the standard warning in this circumstance is that if you're sitting with someone that perhaps you don't want to be seen sitting next to, now would be a good time to move somewhere else. All three of tonight's gala readers will be available for signing and conversation in the theater lobby at the conclusion of this evening's readings. Their books will be on sale there also. And now it's my pleasure to present my colleague, our festival coordinator, Our Lady of the Books, Kim Anderson, who will introduce Mark Spragg. Thank you.
Hello, Missoula and beyond. It's wonderful to be standing here in front of you looking my best. I fell in love with Mark Spragg 5 years ago. And that was before I knew he had red hair, before I knew what an extremely charming man he is. I read Where Rivers Change Direction and fell in love with his voice. As many of you know, Mark is from Wyoming, born and bred, and still there, although he's spending a lot more time in Red Lodge, so now we try to claim him as our own. He published his amazing memoir, Where Rivers Change Direction, in 1999, and received the Mountains and Plains Booksellers Award for that book in 2000. He followed Where Rivers Change Direction with the acclaimed first novel, Fruit of Stone. And very quickly after that, published an even more highly acclaimed novel, An Unfinished Life, which was recently released. In a fairly unusual working method, Mark and his wife, Virginia, simultaneously worked on a screenplay version. Mark had been a screenwriter for quite a few years. The movie, directed by Lasse Hallström and starring Robert Redford, Morgan Freeman, and Jennifer Lopez, will be released early in 2005. If it's half as good as the book, it'll be a wonderful movie. In all of his work, for me, Mark talks about how very, very hard it is to be truly human. And for several hundred pages, he lets us live someone else's journey along that road. He lets us live someone else's struggles and victories. And that, too, is what I love about his work. It is my great honor to welcome onto our stage Mark Spragg.
Thanks to Kim for that very generous introduction. When you hear something like that, it makes you feel like you want to mount some sort of rebuttal, give you some sort of shameful confession that, as my brother-in-law once told me, that once I killed a gopher with a stick, something along those lines. I've been up here, I think, 4 years now. It's always felt like a privilege to me to be asked to participate in this festival. The warmth with which this community of accomplished writers, this community of careful readers has embraced my work has been for me an extraordinary gift. My thanks to Kim and Mark, to the Montana Committee for the Humanities and the Center for the Book. I'm also delighted tonight to be reading with Jim Burke and Chuck Palahniuk. On a panel this afternoon, David McCummer asked me to say a little bit about the genesis of this novel. In the other books that I started, I felt that I had some notion of the book I was going to try to render. This book happened in a completely different way, however. Its main character, a man whose name finally became Einar Gilkison, started showing up in my daydreams some years ago. I was working on another book, and I tried to ignore him. He was a very persistent man and started showing up in my night dreams. This book became his story. It became primarily a novel of forgiveness. Tonight, I'll read 3 short chapters. The first one will introduce you to Einar. It'll introduce you to his memory of his son Griffin, and briefly to a man named Mitch Bradley, with whom Einar has lived and worked a piece of land in Wyoming in this fictional town, or outside this fictional town of Issaquah, for the past 50 years. It starts out in an outdoor sauna. I tell you that because my Finnish translator was so excited by this news that he emailed me 6 times. It seems the last American novel that he had translated was one of Pynchon's, and there were no saunas in it. So, from an unfinished life. The sapwood snaps, shifts in the low-bellied stove, and the heat swells up against the roof boards, and weathered fir planking, and the whole small building seems to groan. It's the first cool night of the fall. Good night for a sweat, and Einar adjusts his wet back and ass in the webbing of the lawn chair. He feels the full weight of his 70 years and wishes he thought to bring a towel to drape over the webbing, but he was in here just this spring and he hadn't remembered one then either. He scoops a dipper of water from the pail beside the chair and casts it across the stovetop where it sizzles and steams. He wishes he would have known this was the way it was going to be. Some old son of a bitch should have explained getting old to me, he says aloud, and then bows his head against the wet pulse of heat. Hell, some old son of a bitch probably did, and I wasn't listening. The sweat drips from his nose and chin. He reaches his denim shirt from where he hung it on a nail, soaks it in the bucket, and then stands to wring it and mop his face and chest. He spreads the shirt over the chair and sits back down, staring at the chair that stands empty before him. Both chairs raised up on this platform into the heat. Through the west window, he watches the amber moonlight on the pasture and remembers the fall they skidded in the field stones and mortared them into the foundation under this board floor. The building was Griffin's idea. He'd said, "Dad, I need it. I really do." "You need a sauna?" Einar asked. "I'm a Viking," the boy said. "It's what the Vikings did." All of this 20 years ago. Mitch helping them frame the walls and the headers for the door and windows, and Griffin just a boy, but already used to working with the diligence of a man, and not a boy who'd ever asked for much. They put in a south-facing window, this one to the west, and a square of double-pane glass in the slanting roof so they could see the stars, and a smaller pane low in the east wall for the benefit of the boy's dog, so Carl could lie on the porch and stare in at them. When they were finished, Griffin took each man by a hand, standing between them, and bowed his head. "God bless this place," he said. He was serious, original. He wasn't just repeating something he'd heard. "Is there anything else you need?" Mitch had asked. The boy shaded his eyes, looking up at the man. "You could sit in here with us." Mitch's face shone even blacker in the sun, like wet obsidian. "Even though I'm no Viking." He bent down over the boy. "Even though my great-granddad was an African man." "I guess that means no," Griffin said. Mitch shoved him away playfully, the way men roughhouse with boys. "I guess I won't," he said. "I believe I've sweated enough in this life already." Einar smiles at the clarity of the memory. He works his jaw, and his ears pop as if he were descending from a great height, and the old dog fidgets on the porch, then settles its gray jowls on its crossed paws and stares in through the little window. His name's Carl, but it's not the original Carl. Just another dog taken from the town shelter, worked and fed and given a place to rest and grow lame. The first Carl lies buried behind the barn, dead and buried like his son Griffin and his wife Ella. He straightens in the chair and wonders if the dog wishes it had a boy for company. Not his boy, just some other kid. He wonders what it is that dogs long for, or if they long. Maybe they just wait patiently for some improvement in their lives. He thinks he's a man who knows something of waiting, but the heat's gotten to him and he feels his stomach come up and shorten his breath. He cracks a window and sucks at the draft of night air. He drops his head back and stares through the window in the roof. Pegasus has risen in the dark sky, poised as if for a run of magic, or that's what he used to think. Now he looks at the stars and sees only a silent, uncaring witness, and tonight feels this press of steam-thick heat, smells the odor of living wood reduced to ash, no magic. He pops a wooden match with his thumbnail and lights a candle on the shelf by his elbow. He shakes the match out, looks down at his shriveled thighs and worn knees. His legs are white as summer cloud, blue-veined. At least his arms and shoulders are still strong, and he tightens his chest, the muscles in his neck. To the empty chair he says, "I've always been puny through the hindquarters, from the get-go. It's not news." He scoots forward on the chair and takes the quart mason jar from the shelf, holds it below him, and pisses it half full before setting it down by the water bucket. He thumbs the sweat from his eyebrows and blinks at the walls and shelves, at the fist-sized chunks of agate and quartz, the petrified wood, and half a dozen of the boy's favorite books. There's the huck feathers he'd hung on the walls, the skull of a black baldy bull, a map of Norway cut out of a National Geographic carefully with a razor blade, one of Iceland, the picture of a bearded man in a horned helmet, and another of a tall black man with a spear balanced on a single leg, both from National Geographic, this Norseman and Senegalese hunter. The boy saw himself as dangerous, raised as he was by the descendants of warriors. Einar stares down at the dog again and thinks it'd be a fine thing to have that kind of focus, to have a small window with something to stare at on the other side. He wishes for his own window and wonders what he might see, and then wonders if Mitch has gone to sleep for the night. He pushes out of his chair and opens the door. He carries the jar at his side, and steps to the edge of the porch boards and sloshes the piss out into the darkness. He stands steaming in the cool air. The dog shifts, but won't rise. Its hip so brittle with arthritis that it moves only when it must. Einar turns back to the doorway and says, "Isn't this just like old times?" And the dog blinks its clouded eyes and yawns. And Einar thinks, this is an animal that should be called out into the tall weeds, shot in the head and buried next to its namesake. But he knows Mitch would never stand for it. Mitch believes in suffering as a right, a burden, even sacred for both man and beast. Einar and Mitch met in Korea. Mitch came back with Einar to work this piece of land with him. They've been together all that time. Mitch is a landless man. He was a man without family, a man who adopted Einar's family, felt the loss of Einar's wife, felt the loss of Einar's son. Einar's daughter-in-law, a woman named Jean, has returned to the ranch and brought with her her 10-year-old daughter and her personal sad story. So Mitch is understandably very excited to meet this little girl. He's assuming that she may become another part of family in his heart. He's asked Einar to ask the little girl, whose name is Griff, to bring him his lunch. So from further along in an unfinished life, this scene between Mitch and Griff. Mitch hears her steps on the porch boards. Here's her pause, here's her knock. "You're going to have to let yourself in," he calls. There's another pause, longer this time. There's no doorknob. Her voice sounds puzzled, almost lost, and he thinks he should have remembered the door. He's allowed himself to get excited, and that's why he didn't. "Pull the thong," he shouts, and wonders just how strange he'll seem to her. Certainly a sight more incomprehensible than a door without a knob. He's worried he'll frighten her, that his appearance might somehow damage the girl. He buttons his shirt at his throat and feels around the collar to make sure it's not crimped, or that the points of the collar aren't sticking up. There's just a latch on the inside. The thong lifts the latch. The door swings open and Carl stands up wagging his tail. And Mitch tucks his feet back under his chair. He's gotten his boots on, but not laced. doesn't want her to notice. She stands blinking in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust. She takes a step into the room, and he thinks this, like the latch string, is something else he should have considered. He's not prepared for how much she resembles her father. She has her father's chin, the same upswell in her lower lip. She holds her shoulders squared with her hips fallen back on her frame, just as Griffin faced the world. It's her father's body she's in, he thinks, her inheritance. My name's Griff Gilkinson. I'm over here, he says. She turns to the sound of his voice. The light from the open door falls across to where he sits on the far side of the table at the foot of the bed, shadowed. He's where he planned to be sitting, not wanting to be the first thing she saw. She walks out of the glare and stops, wincing at the sight of him as though she's been slapped. She stares down at the tray, and he leans back in his chair. He saw the flash of panic in her eyes and imagines her counting the objects on the tray, the glasses, plates, the paper napkins, counting them twice, wishing there were more things to count. He asks, "Are you feeling dizzy?" She nods. She actually widens her stance as if she's afraid she might fall. "Why don't you slide the tray on the table if you think you're going to drop it?" She steps forward and sets the tray just on the table's edge, then folds her arms across her chest with her hands hidden under her arms. She tilts her head to sneak a better look. "I thought I might throw up the first time I had a look at it," he says. She nods with her head still tilted and clears her throat like an uncomfortable adult might. "I've puked lots of times," she says. "My mom says that's why I never stay sick very long. I get it out of my system." She clears her throat again, but doesn't step away. The door's still open, and she hasn't moved toward it. He hoped she'd be a brave girl, that she'd stand her ground. He thinks that's another aspect of her father she owns. When I was still in the hospital, he tells her, a nurse brought me a mirror after they took the bandages off. I got lightheaded, and I couldn't look in a mirror, not again for a long while. He sets the plates on the table and props the tray up against the foot of the bed. He says, "There's 2 whole sandwiches here. One of them's mine," she says, and takes a deep breath, like she's been asked to swim the length of a pool underwater from one end to the other. She levels her head and makes her face appear like everything's just right. And he wonders how much practice she's had at it, how many times she's been required to stare at something horrible and act as though it's nothing at all. She takes another step toward the table and still hasn't looked away from him. "When the nurse brought you the mirror, did you puke then, or were you just dizzy?" "I was just dizzy." He takes a bite of his sandwich. "The only time I ever threw up was when I saw a man eat a snail." She raises an eyebrow. "People don't eat snails." "Yeah, they do. I didn't believe it either till I saw it." He sips his milk and wipes his lip with the back of his hand, and when he doesn't say anything else, she slips into the chair where he put her plate. She's so slight, she doesn't have to pull the chair away from the table. She looks like she's still thinking about snails. She picks up her sandwich in both hands and stares right at him before she takes a bite. "Does it hurt a lot?" "No, it itches sometimes." He traces a finger over the slick pad of scar tissue on his cheek, the part that drags the corner of his mouth down. "I think," he says, "this part here sort of looks like a map of India." She takes another bite of her sandwich. She says, "I don't know what India looks like." And then, I'm sorry I talked with my mouth full." She holds a paper napkin in front of her mouth while she chews. After she swallows, she lowers it. "What happened to you?" "I got mauled by a bear. A real bear." She can't hide the astonishment on her face. "It wasn't the bear's fault. He was eating one of your granddad's calves, and we interrupted his dinner. We were kind of like uninvited guests." The dog circles and lies down again. She watches him until he's settled. "Why didn't the bear bite Einer?" I was closer. And I was out of the truck. She puts the sandwich back on her plate. But he saved you, right? Yeah, I did. He shot the bear. She nods and leans a little to the side, as though to look behind him, but he knows there's nothing there worth seeing. He turns his head so she can see the whole side of his face, where his left ear should be. Her cheek ticks before she makes her face plain again. She touches her own ear. You're making up the part about the bear, right? Do I look made up to you? She shakes her head without seeming aware of it. May I touch it, she asks. He puts his sandwich down and pushes the plate away. He didn't think she'd be this brave, and he's not sure her father would have been. He says, no one's ever asked me that before. She slips out of the chair and stands by his side, raising a hand and then wiping it against her pants and raising it again. When he closes his eyes, he feels the small pad of a single finger move tenderly over the side of his face. She says, it's a lot smoother than I thought it would be. He opens his eyes when he hears her move. He watches her carry her sandwich to Carl and kneel down by the dog. She feeds him the meat, then sniffs the bread and lets him eat that too. The sandwich isn't very good, she says. Well, Einer's not much of a cook. She's still holding the napkin when she stands up, looking around the room. He doesn't realize she's looking for a trash can until she wads a napkin into her pants pocket. Then she steps to the workbench and bends over the antler clamped in the vise. These are little dogs, she says. They're wolves. She looks at him and then back at the antler. She nods, taking his word for it. Did you make this? I made all of them. She studies the antlers hung against the log walls, spinning slowly in a circle. Did you bury the bear? Your grandfather didn't kill the bear, he tells her. He just wounded it. She stares at the floor, perhaps thinking of how a bear might heal itself, then walks to the window and puts her hands up against the sill. He watches her study the mountains. Was it a mother bear, she asks. You mean, was it a bear trying to protect her cubs? She nods without turning. No, it wasn't. It was just an old fella. It was just an old bear was having trouble making a living. They don't usually come down this close to people. She turns. Then it doesn't happen all the time. I mean, you don't always have to watch where you go. No, he tells her. It happens sometimes in Yellowstone. Not for a long time here. My mom told me which way Yellowstone is, she says, and comes back to the table. Where'd you see the man eat the snail? In a restaurant in Denver. His left hand rests on the table in front of his plate, and she touches the back of it, skidding her finger toward his wrist to pull the creases away from his knuckles. Scar tissue just shows just under the cuff. And she touches there too, so lightly, he thinks, that if his eyes were closed, he could mistake it for a breeze, but his eyes aren't closed. And when she blinks, the light through the window flickers in her long lashes. She doesn't look up from his hand. Once, she says, I saw this kid eat a miller moth. And finally, this scene from further yet along in the book, in which you'll meet Jean, Griff's mother, and a man named Crane. The tension between Crane and Jean have been building. Their increasing interest in one another has made them both uncomfortable. I think I originally wanted to write this scene because I wanted to see if something redemptive and interesting could happen in a police car. He studies the menu, so he won't have to look at her. She's standing beside him, waiting to take his order. She smells salty and sweet. He puts his menu down. What was the special? It was pot roast. The cafe windows behind her. It's like she stepped right out of the glare, something solid and warm and to him unexpectedly beautiful. He wonders if she's uncomfortable with her beauty, or maybe she doesn't care how she looks. His mother always told him, marry a beautiful woman who doesn't know it. His ex-wife knew. You told me that already, didn't you? Twice, she says. He hands her his menu. I guess the pot roast will be fine then. He feels like this could be the start of something. She sits at the table, and her hands are shaking, and she puts the menu down and clasps them together as if she's about to pray. Her smile's the kind he'd expect from her daughter. Do you think a man and woman, she stops, looks toward the kitchen and leans further over her hands. Do you think a man and woman can have a sexual relationship with no emotional involvement? He sits back in his chair. She's still leaning toward him over her hands. Bing bang. His voice cracks. Gone about their day, that sort of thing. She nods. Nobody gets hurt. I don't know. She reaches across the table and takes his hand in hers. Her hands are cool. What if the woman was me? He stares down at their hands. I guess I still don't know. But you've thought about it, right? I mean, like a fantasy. With someone you've just met and might never see again. He nods. Yes, I have. She takes a pen from her apron and opens his hand and writes on his palm. The pen tickles, but he can't tell what she's written. She closes his hand and holds it closed. Was it harder when you were thinking about saying that, or was it harder just now, he asks. It wasn't easy either time. Her eyes flick toward the kitchen again. I'm only going to be here 3 more weeks. I'm falling to pieces. I mean, falling to pieces. I need... She pauses and bows her head. He can't tell if she's closed her eyes. Something to sort of settle me out. He hasn't lied to her. He has fantasized about a conversation like this more than once. But the woman's never been this beautiful. He says 3 weeks isn't much of a relationship. Her head snaps up like she's been waiting for him to say this very thing, like she's thought it all through. The kind of relationship I'm talking about could be over in 20 minutes. She realizes she's spoken too loud and lowers her voice. I'm not kidding. I really don't want to be in love. You just want sex. She stands and straightens her apron, then picks up the menu and holds it against her chest. I just want something that's easy to leave. He watches her walk toward the kitchen and then opens his hand. Written on his palm is, please. She's waiting for him in the alley after work, and he hurries around to her door, but she already has it open before he gets there. Thanks anyway, she says, and he says, you bet. That's all they say. She didn't tell him anything about her afternoon, and he doesn't tell her. He drove home after lunch and showered and shaved and splashed on aftershave, and then showered again to wash the aftershave off. He doesn't tell her he almost didn't come. Or that he prayed, actually got down on his goddamn hands and knees and prayed he wasn't making the biggest mistake of his life. He parks by the river. The dirt turn around under the cottonwoods and kills the engine. They sit for a minute and listen to the wind and the leaves, and then step out of the blazer and into the back seat. They hurry. They're awkward at first, silent and urgent. And then he bangs his head on the door frame and they laugh a little. They're better after they relax. It shocks him how much better. It's as though he knows her body, what to expect from her, how she'll move or rise or float away from him, how he can bring her back. It's as though he's heard the sound she makes, knows that she'll grind her teeth, gasp, and that her face will appear frightened for a time, and then finally wondering. It's not the way he's ever made love. It's not even close. At the end, she holds on to him and won't let go. It's surprising to him that he doesn't want her to let go. They lie together on the seat in the tangle of clothes until the afternoon starts to cool. She's the first to struggle up. She sits on the edge of the seat, folds an arm over her breast, then looks down at her arm and drops it. There's a wide, yellowed bruise across her ribs that starts just above her right hip. He touches a fingertip to the edge of it. "I'm sorry," he says. "It wasn't you." "I know it wasn't, but I'm still sorry." She pulls his shirt out from under and holds it up. The front pocket's ripped. "I don't sew," she says. "It's all right, I've got another one in the back." She nods and rubs a footprint off the plexiglass divider. Then she wipes her face with the shirt and under her breasts and steps out into the breeze and wipes between her legs. He pulls on his pants and stands out of the car. He opens the back hatch and takes out the clean shirt, watching through the side window as she gets into her bra and panties and jeans. The sun's low, the air fuzzy with pollen, and he doesn't know what to expect. He looks at his palm as if for a clue, but there isn't even a smear of ink left. When he closes the hatch, she says, "You don't have to worry. My head's not going to start spinning around or anything." And when he doesn't say anything, just buttons the shirt, she adds, "Like in The Exorcist." "I'm not worried about it," he says. But he is worried. He's worried that what happened only happened to him, and for her it was just exercise. "I'm not going to start blubbering about us being soulmates either." She draws her hair into a ponytail and gets into the passenger seat. He opens the front door and sits back against the edge of the seat and pulls on his boots. His elbow nudges the horn, and when it blares, he jumps, and she starts to laugh, and he does too. He rubs his head where he banged it on the door frame. "You're dying to ask me how it was, aren't you? Come on, admit it," she says. He gets behind the wheel. "I don't ask questions unless I think I can stand the answers. That's a good rule." He backs them around, facing the sun, and lowers his visor. He lets the outfit idle. "Why me?" he asks. And she hadn't turned the visor down on her side, and her face is lost in the glare. "Issawa may have 2 restaurants, but there aren't too many attractive men," she says. He pulls ahead till her face falls in shadow. He wants to see whether she's mocking him, but she just looks ready for a nap. "You think I'm attractive?" "I wouldn't let it go to your head," she shrugs. "My tastes aren't exactly what you'd call a resume builder." He pulls onto the blacktop driving northwest. "I'm sorry about your shirt," she says. He likes the whine the tires make on the pavement. He's liked it since he was a boy. And the air's just started to have some snap in the evenings. Fall's his favorite time of year. "So how was it?" he asks. She leans across the console, and he can feel her breath on his neck. "Thank you," she whispers. "It settled me right out." Then she straightens up and draws her heels onto the edge of the seat and rides with her arms around her legs, her chin just on her knees. Thanks so much for coming out on a faultless fall evening indoors.
Thank you, Mark. Barbara Thoreau is a friend of writers, readers, librarians, indeed all who cherish books and their importance in our free society. Barbara is owner of Fact and Fiction Bookstore in Missoula, one of several local bookstores that generously support the Montana Festival of the Book. And she is among Western Montana's best known and respected civic and cultural leaders who honors us by serving on our festival steering committee. Please welcome Barbara Thoreau.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Missoula. It is indeed a pleasure to be a Missoula bookseller, and I have to tell you, in particular during the festival, because something magical happens during the festival, and I do need to take time to acknowledge the bookstore and the booksellers who work together. When I say something magical happens, there are 4 bookstores who for the past 3 years have been combining and collaborating to put together one festival store. These stores give up their corporate, institutional, and private identities to do this. We meet for several months beforehand. We meet with Kim and Mark in one of those neutral territories, i.e. the depot. But we've all come to know and respect and work together, and I would like to take the time tonight to acknowledge those booksellers. Stephanie, Barbara, and Mark from Barnes & Noble. Sarah and Keith from the University Bookstore. Garth from Shakespeare. And my backbone and my biggest support, David Johnson, Kyle McAfee, and Jason Thoreau from Fact and Fiction. And now for what I have been asked to do. It is always a pleasure to work with writers and people from across the country, and especially our Montana authors and our Missoula authors. And Fact and Fiction is 18 years old, and we have hosted 17 events with James Lee Burke. So I guess they figure I might know something about James Lee Burke. We have come a long way. It's been a pleasure to sell each and every one of the Dave Robichaux and Billy Bob Holland books. Jim has received 2 Edgar Awards, one in 1990 for Black Cherry Blues, which features Dave Robichaux, and one in 1998 for Cimarron Rose, featuring Billy Bob Holland. He has these 2 beloved characters, one that has sidelines and his own website. So now that Billy Bob Holland has moved to Missoula, I'm warning you, look for those sidelines and perhaps a website. Montana and Missoula has honored Jim, and we recognize Jim. Jim is a part of our community. He writes letters to the editor. He dedicates books to people we know. He does the call letters for Montana Public Radio. And Montana has recognized him. He's received the Governor's Arts Award for Literature. He last spring received the H.G. Merriam Award for Literature presented by the Friends of the Mansfield Library. And for several years has won the Independent's Best category for favorite local author. So I was looking for something new. What could I tell you that was a little different about Jim? And I went to the magic world of the internet, to his publisher's website, where I found several letters from fans. And in case you think I'm making any of this up, it's at simonsays.com. I guess fans think they can maybe criticize and point out some facts or errors. This one, after In the Moon of the Red Ponies. Mr. Burke, I just started reading your book, only to chapter 4, and it already is hard to put down. That said, I would like to point out an error on page 24. Poor Ed T. Dumpter's hometown of New Baltimore, Michigan, is not on the shores of Lake Erie, but on the shores of a much smaller lake. Not an important mistake. You only missed it by 75 or 80 miles. Thank you. This one's from Harry in New Jersey, who didn't have spell check, I guess, on his email. You books are the best I ever read. I can't wait until the next one is out. I get them quick, as my wife works in the library. A word of warning to those authors out there, the people also make some comments about the author photos. One about the belt buckle. Would you please let me know where James Lee Burke purchased the Indian head belt buckle on the back cover of In the Moon of the Red Ponies? And people take liberty with names. This one's message is addressed to Jamie Lee. Jamie Lee, you're a good writer and I've read most of your works, but that picture of you on the back cover has got to go, old buddy. You and I'm 65 and we're just too old to wear jeans, but keep up the good work. And in keeping it fair and balanced, this one comes from Carol, saying she was commenting about some of his writing, and she adds, I don't think you look bad in jeans, and then has her little smiley face that you create with the colon and the parentheses. Not that your mode of dress is an issue. And two final ones that are from fans. This one from an avid fan. I started reading JLB's books around 6 years ago and can say that I have yet to find any better. I just finished reading his book, White Doves at Morning. Any book that makes me stop and think, visually see and smell what has been put down on each line, can't get any better. He writes prose, but he's a poet. A reader can tell when an author writes his very best. Lastly, as long as he writes, I will read. And another one that's titled, or entitled, The Impossible Prospect of Relaxation. Dear Mr. Burke, why do I hate your work? Why am I squirming in my soft recliner as I churn through In the Moon of the Red Ponies? Because it's impossible to put it down and take even the smallest break. The tension is unbearable and the realism unsurpassed by any other author of my favorite genre. Reading is to be an escape. Reading your work is a hold your breath, can't take a bathroom break leap. Thank you for the thrills. Thank you, Jim. Let's give him a warm festival welcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks, Barbara, for that fine introduction. And I'd also like to thank Mark and Kim for organizing the event tonight, and express my appreciation to the Montana Committee for the Humanities and the Center for the Book. Also, I'd like to thank all the great people of Missoula, Montana for being here tonight. Missoula is the best place on the planet, brother. This is it. And it's also an honor to read here tonight with writers of the stature of Mark and Chuck. This story is unread by anyone except me, and it's the editor at Southern Review. It's going to come out in the February issue of Southern Review, and I hope you enjoy it. It's titled, Why Bugsy Siegel Was a Friend of Mine. And it's based on experiences out of my youth. My best and oldest friend was a fellow named Tom Crowder. He and I were inseparable when we were kids, and he passed away earlier in the year, and I wrote 3 stories about our childhood together, and this is one of them. In 1947, Nick Hauser and I had only 2 loves in this world, baseball and Cheerio yo-yo contest. That's how we met Benny one spring night after a doubleheader out at Buffalo Stadium on the Galveston Freeway. His brand new Ford convertible, a gleaming maroon job with the starch white top, white wall tires, and blue dot tail lights, was stuck in a sodden field behind the bleachers. Benny was trying to lift the bumper while his girlfriend floored the accelerators, spinning the tires and blowing streams of muddy water and torn grass back in his face. He wore a checkered sports coat, lavender shirt, hand-painted necktie, and two-tone shoes, all of it now whipsawed with mud. But it was his eyes, not his clothes, that you remembered. They were a radiant blue and literally sparkled. "You punks want to earn $2 each?" he said. "Who you calling a punk?" Nick asked. Before Benny could answer, his girlfriend shifted into reverse, caught traction, and backed over his foot. He hopped up and down, holding one shin, trying to bite down on his pain, his eyes lifted heavenward, his lips moving silently. "Get in the fucking car before it sinks in this slop again," his girlfriend yelled. He limped to the passenger side. A moment later, they fishtailed across the grass past us. Her hair was long, blowing out the window, the pinkish red of a flamingo. She thumbed a hot cigarette into the darkness. "Boy, did you check out that babe's bongos? Wow," Nick said. But our evening encounter with Benny and his girlfriend was not over. We were on the shoulder of the freeway trying to hitch a ride downtown, flicking our Cheerios under a street lamp, doing a whole range of upper-level yo-yo tricks, round the world, shoot the moon, rock the cradle, and the atomic bomb, when the maroon convertible roared past us, blowing dust and newspaper in our faces. Suddenly, the convertible cut across 2 lanes of traffic, made a U-turn, then a second U-turn, horns blowing all over the freeway, and braked to a stop abreast of us. "You know who I am?" Benny said. "No," I replied. "My name is Benjamin Siegel." "You're a gangster," Nick said. "He's got you, Benny," the woman behind the wheel said. "How you know that?" Benny said. "We heard your name on Gangbusters. Nick and me listen every Saturday night," I said. "Can you do the Chinese star?" he asked. "We do Chinese stars in our sleep," Nick said. "Get in," Benny said, pulling back the leather seat. "We got to get home," I said. "We'll take you there. Get in," he said. We drove out South Main, past Rice University, and park-like vistas dense with live oak trees. Some of them hung with Spanish moss. In the south, heat lightning flickered over the Gulf of Mexico. Benny bought us fried chicken and ice cream at Bill Williams' Drive-In. And while we ate, his girlfriend smoked cigarettes behind the wheel and listened to the radio, her thoughts known only to herself, her face so soft and lovely in the dash light, I felt something drop inside me when I stole to look at it. Benny popped open the glove box and removed a top-of-the-line chartreuse Cheerio yo-yo. Behind the yo-yo, I could see the steel surfaces of a semi-automatic pistol. "Now show me the Chinese star," he said. He stood with us in the middle of the drive-in parking lot, watching Nick and me demonstrate the intricate patterns of the most difficult of all the Cheerio competition tricks. Then he tried it himself. His yo-yo tilted sideways, its inner surfaces brushing against the string, then twisted on itself and went dead. "The key is candle wax," I said. "Candle wax?" he said. "Yeah, you wrap the string around a candle and saw it back and forth. That gives you the spin and the time you need to make the pattern for the star," I said. "I never thought of that," he said. It's a breeze," Nick said. "Benny, give it a rest," his girlfriend said from inside the car. 15 minutes later, we dropped off Nick at his house on the dead-end street where I used to be his neighbor. It was a wonderful street, one of trees and flowers and old brick homes, and a horse pasture dotted with live oaks beyond the canebrake that enclosed the cul-de-sac. But when my father died, my mother and I were evicted, and we moved across Westheimer and took up residence in a neighborhood where every sunrise broke on the horizon like a testimony to personal failure. Benny's girlfriend pulled to a stop in front of my house. Benny looked at the broken porch and the orange rust on the screens. "This is where you live?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, my eyes leaving his. He nodded. "You need to study hard, make something of yourself. Go out to California maybe. It's the place to be," he said. Our next door neighbors were the Dunlops. They had skin like pig hide and heads with the knobbed ridges of coconuts. The oldest of the 5 boys was executed in Huntsville Pen. One did time on Sugarland Farm. The patriarch of the family was a security guard at the Southern Pacific Rail Yards. He covered all the exterior surfaces of his house, garage, and tool shed with the yellow paint he stole from his employer. The Dunlops even painted their car with it. Then through a fluke no one could have anticipated, they became rich. One of the girls had married a morphine addict who came from an oil family in River Oaks. The girl and her husband drove their Austin Healey head-on into a bus outside San Antonio. And the Dunlops inherited $200,000 and a huge chunk of rental property in their own neighborhood. It was like giving a tribe of pygmies a nuclear weapon. I thought the Dunlops would move out of their dilapidated 2-story frame house with its piles of dog shit all over the backyard, but instead they bought a used Cadillac from a mortuary, covered their front covered their front porch with glitter-encrusted chalk animals and icons from an amusement park, and each morning continued to piss out the attic window on my mother's car, which looked like it had contracted scabies. As newly empowered landlords, the Dunlops cut no one any slack, did no repairs on their properties, and evicted a Mexican family that had lived in the neighborhood since the mid-Depression. Mr. Dunlop also seized upon an opportunity to repay the parochial school Nick and I attended for expelling 2 of his sons. Maybe it was the emotional deprivation and the severity of the strictures imposed upon them, or the black habits they wore in 90-degree humidity, but a significant number of the nuns at school were inept and cruel. Sister Felicie, however, was not one of these. She was tall, wore steel-rimmed glasses, and small black shoes that didn't seem adequate to support her height. When I spent almost a year in bed with rheumatic fever, she came every other day to the house with my lessons, walking a mile, sometimes in the hottest of weather, her habit powdered with ash from a burned field she had to cross. But things went south for Sister Felicie. We heard that her father, a senior Army officer, was killed at Okinawa. Others said the soldier was not her father, but the fiancé she had given up when she entered the convent. Regardless, at the close of the war, great sadness seemed to descend upon her. In the spring of '47, she would take her science class on a walk through the neighborhood, identifying trees, plants, and flowers along the way. Then, just before 3 p.m., we would end up at Costin's drugstore, and she would let everyone take a rest break on the benches under the outside awning. It was a grand way to end the school day, because on some afternoons the Cheerio Yo-Yo Man would arrive exactly at 3:05 and hold competitions on the corner. But one day, just after the dismissal bell had rung across the street, I saw Sister Felicie walk into the alleyway between the drugstore and Cobb's Liquors and give money to a black man who had an empty eye socket. A few minutes later, I saw her upend a small bottle of fortified wine, what hobos used to call short dogs, then drop it surreptitiously into a trash can. She turned and realized I had been watching her. She walked toward me between the old brick walls of the buildings, her small shoes clicking on pieces of gravel and bottle caps and broken glass, her face stippled with color inside her wimple. "Why aren't you waxing your string for the Cheerio contest?" she asked. "It hasn't started yet, sister," I replied, avoiding her look, trying to smile. "Better run on now," she said. "Are you all right, sister?" I said, then wanted to bite off my tongue. "Of course I'm all right. Why do you ask?" "No reason, none. I just don't think too good sometimes, sister. You know me, I was just..." But she wasn't listening now. She walked past me toward the red light at the corner, her habit in beads swishing against my arm. She smelled like camphor and booze and the lichen in the alley she had bruised under her small shoes. 2 days later, the same ritual repeated itself, except this time, Sister Felicie didn't empty just one short dog and head for the convent. I saw her send the black man back to Cobb's for 2 more bottles. Then she sat down on a rusted metal chair at the back of the alley, a book spread on her knees as though she were reading, the bottles on the ground barely hidden by the hem of her habit. That's when Mr. Dunlop and his son Vernon showed up. Vernon was 17 and by law could not be made to attend school. That fact was a gift from God to the educational system of Southwest Houston. Vernon had half-moon scars on his knuckles, biceps the size of small muskmelons, and deep-set simian eyes that focused on other kids with the moral sympathies of an electric drill. Mr. Dunlop was thoroughly enjoying himself. First, he announced to everyone within earshot he was owner of the entire corner, including the drugstore. He told the Cheerio yo-yo man to beat it and not come back. Then told the kids to either buy something inside the store or get off the benches they were loitering on. His face lit like a jack-o'-lantern's when he saw Sister Felicie emerge from the alley. She was trying to stand straight and not doing a very good job of it. One hand touching the brick wall of the drugstore, a drop of sweat running from the top of her wimple down the side of her nose. "Looks like you got a little bit of the grog in you, sister," Mr. Dunlop said. "What were you saying to the children?" she asked. "Oh, her ladyship wants to know that, does she? Why don't we have a conference with the pastor and hash it out?" Mr. Dunlop said. "Do as you wish," Sister replied, then walked to the red light with the cautionary steps of someone aboard a pitching ship. Mr. Dunlop dropped a buffalo nickel into a payphone, an unlit cigarette in the corner of his mouth. His head was shaved bald, his brow knurled, one eye recessed and glistening with pleasure when somebody picked up on the other end. "Father?" Mr. Dunlop said. His son Vernon squeezed his scrotum and shot us the bone. The Cheerio yo-yo man did not come back to the corner, and Sister Felicie disappeared from school for a week. Then one morning she was back in class, looking joyless and glazed, as though she had just walked out of an ice storm. That afternoon, Benny and his girlfriend pulled into my driveway while I was picking up the trash Vernon and his brothers had thrown out of their attic window into the yard. "I can't get the atom bomb right. Get in the car. We'll pick up your friend on the way out," he said. "Way where?" I said. "The Shamrock Hotel. You want to go swimming and have some eats, don't you?" he said. "I'll leave my mom a note," I said. "Tell her to come out and join us," he replied. That definitely will not flush, I thought, but did not say it. Benny had said he couldn't pull off the yo-yo trick called the atomic bomb. The truth was, he couldn't even master walk the dog. In fact, I couldn't figure why a man with his wealth and criminal reputation would involve himself so intensely with children's games. After Nick and I went swimming, we sat on the balcony of Benny's suite, high above the clover-shaped pool of the Shamrock Hotel, and tried to show him the configurations of the atomic bomb. It was a disaster. He would spread the string between his fingers, then drop the yo-yo through the wrong spaces, knotting the string, rendering it useless. He danced up and down on the balls of his feet in frustration. There's something wrong with this yo-yo. I'm going to go back to the guy who sold it to me and stuff it down his throat, he said. He's full of shit, kids, his girlfriend said through the open bathroom door. Don't listen to that. You're looking at the guy who almost blew up Mussolini, he said to us. Then he yelled through the French doors into the suite. Tell me I'm full of shit one more time. You're full of shit, she yelled back. That's what you gotta put up with, he said to us. Now teach me the atomic bomb. Blue-black clouds were piled from the horizon all the way to the top of the sky, blooming with trees of lightning that made no sound. Across the street, we could see oil rigs pumping in an emerald green pasture and a half-dozen horses starting to spook at the weather. Benny's girlfriend came out of the bathroom dressed in new jeans and a black and maroon cowboy shirt with a silver stallion on the pocket. She drank from a vodka Collins and her mouth looked cold and hard and beautiful when she lowered the glass. Anybody hungry? She said. I felt myself swallow. Then for reasons I didn't understand, I told her and Benny what Mr. Dunlop had done to Sister Felicie. Benny listened attentively, his handsome face clouding, his fingers splaying his knotted yo-yo string in different directions. Say all that again? This guy Dunlop ran off the Cheerio man? He said. It was almost Easter, and at school that meant Stations of the Cross and a daily catechism reminder about the nature of disloyalty and human failure. When he needed the most, Christ's men bagged it down the road and let him take the weight on his own. I came to appreciate the meaning of betrayal a little better that spring. I thought my account of Mr. Dunlop's abuse of Sister Felicie and the Cheerio man had made him our ally. He said he'd come by the house the next night and straighten out Mr. Dunlop and anyone else who was pushing around kids and nuns and yo-yo instructors. He said these kinds of guys were Nazis and should be boiled into lard and poured into soap molds. He said, don't worry, kid. I owe you guys. You taught me the atomic bomb in the Chinese store. The next day after school, when I was raking leaves in the yard, Vernon used his slingshot to shoot me in the back with a marble. I felt the pain go into the bone like a cold chisel. Got a crick? He said. Yeah, I said, mindlessly squeezing my shoulders back, my eyes shut. How about some hair of the dog that bit you? He said, fishing another marble out of his shirt pocket. You screwed with Benny Siegel, Vernon. He's going to stuff you in a toilet bowl, I said. Yeah? Who is Benny Siegel? Ask your old man, I said. Oh, I forgot, Vernon. He can't read either. Vernon's fist came out of the sky and knocked me to the ground. I felt my breath go out of my chest as though it were being sucked into a giant vacuum cleaner. Through the kitchen window, I could see my mother washing dishes, her face bent down toward the sink. Vernon unbuckled my belt, worked the top button loose on my jeans, and pulled them off my legs, dragging me through the dust. The clouds, trees, garage, alleyway, even the dog dumps spun in circles around me. Vernon pulled one of my pants legs inside out and used it to blow his nose. Benny and his girlfriend did not show up at my house that night. I called the Shamrock Hotel and asked for his room. There's no one registered here by that name, the clerk said. Has he checked out? There was a pause. We have no record of a guest with that name. I'm sorry. Thank you for calling the Shamrock, the clerk said, and hung up. The next day at recess, I saw Sister Felicie sitting on a stone bench under a live oak in a garden behind the church. Her black habit was spangled with sunlight, her beads lying across her open palm, as though the wind had robbed her of her concentration. Her face looked like ceramic, polished, faintly pink, not quite real. She smelled of soap or perhaps shampoo in her close-cropped hair, which was covered with a skull cap and veil that must have been unbearable in the summer months. You're supposed to be on the playground, Charlie, she said. I told Benny Siegel what Mr. Dunlop did to you. He promised to help, but he didn't show up last night, I said. What are you talking about? Benny is a gangster. Nick and I have been teaching him yo-yo tricks. He built a casino in Nevada. I am convinced you'll be a great writer one day, she said. And for the first time in weeks, she smiled. You're a good boy, Charlie. I may not see you again, at least for a while, but you'll be in my prayers. Not see you, I said. Run along now. Don't hang out with too many gangsters, she said. She patted me on top of the head, then touched my cheek. Benny had shown Nick and me color photographs of the resort hotel and gambling casino he had built in the desert. He also showed us a picture of him and his girlfriend building a snowman in front of a log cabin in western Montana. In the photograph, she was smiling and looked much younger, somehow innocent among evergreens that rang with winter light. She wore a fluffy pink sweater and knee-length boots stitched with Christmas designs. I kept wanting to believe Benny would call or come by, but he didn't. I dreamed about a building in a desert, its exteriors scrolled with neon, with the grassy pond on one side of it where flamingos stood in the water, arching their necks, pecking at the insects in their feathers. I put away my Cheerio yo-yo and no longer listened to ball games at Buffalo Stadium. I refused to eat without understanding why, threw my lunch in a garbage can on the way to school, and fantasized about hurting Vernon Dunlop. We'll set fire to his house, Nick said. Serious? I said, looking up from the box of shoes we were shining in his garage. It's a thought, he replied. What if somebody gets killed? I said. That's the brakes when you're white trash, Nick said. He grinned, his face full of play. He had a burr haircut and the overhead light reflected on his scalp. Nick was a good boxer, swallowed his blood in a fight, and never let anyone know when he was hurt. Secretly, I always wished I was tough as he was. He and I had a shoe shine route. We collected shoes from all over the neighborhood and shined them for 10 cents a pair, using only one color, brown. Home delivery was free. Nick peeled a Milky Way and bit into it. He chewed thoughtfully, then offered the candy bar to me. I shook my head. You gotta eat, he said. Who says? I replied. You make me sad, Charlie, he said. My father was an old-time pipeline man whose best friend was killed by his side on the last day of World War I. He read classical literature, refused to mow the lawn under any circumstances, spent more days than he should in the beer joint, attended church irregularly, and contended there were only two facts you had to remember about the nature of God, that he had a sense of humor, and as a gentleman, he never broke his word. The last part always stuck with me. Benny had proved himself a liar and a bum. My sense of having been used by him seemed to grow daily. My mother could not make me eat even when my hunger was eating its way through my insides like a starving organism that had to consume its host in order to survive. I had bed spins when I woke in the morning and vertigo when I rode my bike to school, wobbling between automobiles while the sky, trees, and buildings around me dissolved into a vortex of atomic particles. My mother tried to tempt me from my abstinence with the cake she baked, and the following day with the codfish dinner she brought from the cafeteria, wrapped in foil, butter oozing from an Irish potato that was still hot from the oven. I rushed from the house and pedaled my bike to Nick's. We sat inside the canebrake at the end of our street while the day cooled and the evening star twinkled in the west. There was a bitter taste in my mouth, like the taste of zinc pennies. "You miss your dad?" Nick asked. "I don't think about it much anymore. It was an accident. Why go around feeling bad about an accident?" I replied, turning my face from his, looking at the turquoise rim along the bottom of the sky. "My old man always says your dad was stand-up," Nick said. "Benny Siegel treated us like jerks, Nick," I said. "Who cares about Benny Siegel?" he said. I didn't have an answer for him, nor could I explain why I felt the way I did. I rode my bike home in the dusk, then found a heavy rock in the alley and threw it against the side of the Dunlop's house. It struck the wood so hard the glass in the windows rattled. Vernon came out on the back porch eating a piece of fried chicken, his body silhouetted in the kitchen light. He wore a strap undershirt and his belt was unbuckled, hanging loosely over his fly. "You're lucky, Dick Wipe. I got a date tonight, but wait till tomorrow," he said. He shook his chicken bone at me. I couldn't sleep that night. I had terrible dreams about facing Vernon in the morning. How could I have been so foolish as to actually assault his house? I wished I had taken the pounding right then when I was in hot blood and not trembling with fear. I woke at 2 a.m. and threw up in the toilet, then went into the dry heaves. I lay in bed, my head under the pillow. I prayed an asteroid would crash into our neighborhood so I wouldn't have to see the sunrise. At around 5 o'clock, I fell asleep. Later, I heard wind rattle the roof, then a loud knocking sound like a door slamming repeatedly on a door jamb. When I looked out my screen window, I could see fog on the street and a maroon convertible with white wall tires parked in front of the Dunlop's house. An olive-skinned man with patent leather hair parted down the middle, wearing a clip-on bow tie and crinkling shirt, sat in the passenger seat. I rubbed my eyes. It was the Cheerio man Mr. Dunlop had run off from the parking lot in front of Costin's drugstore. Then I heard Benny's voice on the Dunlop's porch. "See, you can't treat people like that. This is the United States, not Mussoliniville. So we need to walk out here and apologize to this guy and invite him back to the corner by the school. You're good with that, aren't you?" There was a gap in the monologue. Then Benny's voice resumed. "You're not good with that. You're going to deny kids the right to enter Cheerio yo-yo contest. You think all those soldiers died in the war for nothing. That's what you're saying. You're some kind of Nazi pushing around little people. Look at me when I'm talking here." Then Benny and Mr. Dunlop walked out to the convertible and talked to the Cheerio man. A moment later, Benny got behind the wheel and the convertible disappeared in the fog. I fell sound asleep in the deep blue coolness of the room with a sense of confidence in the world I had not felt since the day the war ended. And Kate Smith's voice sang "God Bless America" from every radio in the neighborhood. When I woke, it was hot and bright outside, the wind touched with dust and the stench of melted tar. I told my mother of Benny Siegel's visit to the Dunlops. "You must have had a dream, Charlie. I was up early. I would have heard," she said. "No, it was Benny. His girlfriend wasn't with him, but the Cheerio man was." She smiled wanly, her eyes full of pity. "You've starved yourself and you break my heart. Nobody was out there, Charlie. Nobody," she said. I went out to the curb. No one ever parked in front of the Dunlop's house. And because the sewer drain was clogged, a patina of mud always dried along the edge of the gutter after each rain. I walked out in the street so I wouldn't be on the Dunlop's property, my eyes searching along the seam between the asphalt and the gutter. But I could see no tire imprint in the gray film left over from the last rain. I knelt down and touched the dust with my fingers. Vernon opened his front door and held it back on the spring. He was bare-chested, a pair of sweatpants tied below his navel. "Losing your marbles, Frump?" he asked. By noon, my skin was crawling with anxiety and fear. Worse, I felt an abiding shame in the fact that once again I had been betrayed by my own vanity and foolish trust in others. I didn't care anymore whether Vernon beat me up or not. In fact, I wanted to see myself injured. Through the kitchen window, I could see him pounding dust out of a rug on the wash line with a broken tennis racket. I walked down the back steps and crossed into his yard. "Vernon," I said, "your butt-kicking appointment is after lunch. I'm busy right now. In the meantime, entertain yourself by giving a blowjob to a doorknob," he replied. "This won't take long," I said. He turned around, exasperated. I hit him hard on the corner of the mouth with the right cross that Nick Hauser would have been proud of. It broke Vernon's lip against his teeth, whipping his face sideways. He stared back in disbelief, a string of spittle and blood on his cheek. Before he could raise his hands, I hit him again, this time square on the nose. I felt it flatten and blood fly under my knuckles. Then I caught him in the eye and throat. I took one in the side of the head and felt another slide off my shoulder, but I was under his reach now, and I got him again in the mouth, this time hurting him more than he was willing to live with. He stepped back from me, blood draining from his split lip, his teeth red, his face twitching with shock. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw his father appear on the back porch. "Get in here, boy, before I whoop your ass worse than it already is," Mr. Dunlop said. That afternoon, Nick Hauser and I went to a baseball game at Buffalo Stadium. When I came home, my mother told me I'd received a long-distance telephone call. This was in an era when people only called long distance to inform family members that a loved one had died. I called the operator and was soon connected to Sister Felicie. She told me she was back at Our Lady of the Lake, the college in San Antonio, where she had trained to become a teacher. "I appreciate what your friend has tried to do, but would you tell him everything is fine now, that he doesn't need to act on my behalf anymore," she said. "Which friend?" I asked. "Mr. Siegel. He's called the archdiocese twice." I heard her laugh, then clear her throat. "Can you do that for me, Charlie?" But I never saw Benny or his girlfriend again. In late June, I read in the newspaper that Benny had been at her cottage in Beverly Hills reading the Los Angeles Times when someone outside had propped a M1 carbine across the fork of a tree and fired directly into Benny's face, blowing one eye 15 feet from his head. Years later, I'd read a news story about his girlfriend, whose nickname was the Flamingo, and how she died by suicide in a snowbank in Austria. I sometimes wondered if in those last moments of her life she did not try to return to that wintertime photograph of her and Benny building a snowman in West Montana. Vernon Dunlop never bothered me again. In fact, I came to have a sad kind of respect for the type of life that had been imposed upon him. Vernon was killed at the Battle of Incheon during the Korean War. Nick Hauser and I became school teachers. The era in which we grew up was a poem, and Bugsy Siegel was a friend of mine. Well, thank you all a million, and God bless you. Thank you.
Chuck Palahniuk burst on the literary scene in 1996 with his novel Fight Club, later made into a feature film by director David Fincher in 20th Century Fox. 7 more books have followed in 8 years: Choke, Invisible Monsters, Survivor, Lullaby, Fugitives and Refugees, Diary, and most recently the essay collection Stranger Than Fiction. Chuck has won the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award twice, in 1997 for Fight Club and in 2003 for Lullaby. Perhaps no writer has garnered the following of readers and fans among the internet generation that Chuck has, through his writings, his personal appearances, and his presence on the World Wide Web. Perhaps no writer is as devoted to his readers as Chuck is, as we've already seen here in Missoula. And I must say, perhaps in contrast to the Tyler Durden image, Chuck is among the most considerate, agreeable, and generous people you will encounter in the writing world. Chuck's writing style is often described as minimalist. The effect, as we have seen in book after book, is maximal. After the festival is over and some more books have been signed, I understand his fans may get a chance to hear some of the maximal a little bit later this evening. So, ladies and gentlemen, please stow your tray tables. Return your seats to full upright position. Fasten your seat belts tightly. Take a very deep breath. Here's Chuck Palahniuk.
I hope you can appreciate how difficult it is to follow James Lee Burke. Boy, 4 years ago, when I first saw, became aware of Laura Bush, at first I thought she was really classy. I thought maybe it was the haircut or the fact that she'd been a librarian. I just automatically liked Laura Bush until I saw her on Oprah Winfrey, on the show, I mean. And she's talking to Oprah Winfrey about books. And she's talking very good about books, and she says, books are important because books help us fall asleep at night. I'm like, Mrs. Bush, I got fucking drugs to fall asleep at night. There are things at this point in history, boo? There are things at this... Security? There are things at this point in history that only books can talk about. Movies cannot go these places. Music cannot go these places. Television sure as hell can't go these places. But books can, because books are such a private, intimate, consensual, form of mass media. And I hesitate to say mass media because, compared to movies, television, music, books don't count for jack shit. I'm sorry. But that gives books a freedom to talk about things and to go places that nothing else can. And that is what I want from books. I want what I can't get from any other form of communication. That's what I want from books. And what I'm going to read right now is a short story from next year's book. And next year's book is a collection of 29 ghost stories that are bridged by the chapters of a novella. And the ghost stories are all sort of based on if Edgar Allan Poe were alive right now, what would he be writing about with all the freedom we have to talk about stuff right now? And maybe a little later, after I go out and I sign a few books for the folks who absolutely have to go, I might secretly sort of read another much shorter but also much funnier piece for those of you who have a very strong constitution. But for now, I'm going to read a short story called Hot Potting. Come January nights, Brenda used to say that every drunk driver was a blessing. Every couple looking for a second honeymoon to patch up their marriage, people falling asleep at the steering wheel, anybody who pulled off the highway for a drink, they were somebody that Brenda could maybe talk into renting a room. That used to be half her business, talking, to keep people buying another next drink and another until they had to stay. Sometimes, sure, you're trapped. Other times, Brenda would say, you just sit down for what turns out to be the rest of your life. Rooms here at the lodge, most people, they expect better. The iron bed frames, they teeter, the rails and footboards are worn where they notch together. The nuts and bolts loose. Upstairs, every mattress is lumpy as foothills. The pillows are flat. The sheets are clean, but the well water up here, it's really hard. You wash anything in this water, and the fabric feels sandpaper rough with minerals and smells of sulfur. The final insult is you have to share a bathroom down the hall. Most folks, they don't travel with a bathrobe, and this means getting dressed just to take a leak. In the morning, you wake up to a stinking sulfur bath in a white, cold, cast iron clawfoot tub. It's a pleasure for Brenda to herd these January strangers toward her cliff. First, she shuts off the music. A full hour before she'd even start talking, she'll turn down the volume a notch every 10 minutes until Glenn Campbell is gone. After traffic turns to nothing going by on the road outside, Brenda turns down the heat. One by one, she pulls the strings that snap off each neon beer sign in the window. If there's been a fire in the fireplace, Brenda lets it burn out. All this time, this whole time, she is hurting, asking what plans these folks have. January on the White River, there is less than nothing to do. You can snowshoe, maybe. You can cross-country ski if you bring your own. Brenda lets some guest bring up the idea. Everybody gets around to this same suggestion. And if they don't, then Brenda brings up the idea of hot potting. Her Stations of the Cross, she walks her audience through the roadmap of her story. First, Brenda shows herself how she looked most of her life ago, 20 years ago, and out of college for the summer, car camping on the White River, begging for a summer job, what back then was a dream job, tending bar here at the lodge. It's hard to imagine Brenda skinny with white teeth, before her gums started to pull back, before the way her teeth look now, the brown root of each tooth exposed, the way carrots will crowd each other out of the ground if you plant the seed too close together. It's hard to imagine Brenda voting Democrat, even liking people. Brenda without the dark shadow of hair across her top lip. It's hard to imagine college boys waiting in line an hour to fuck her. It makes her seem honest, saying something so funny and sad like that about herself. It makes people really listen. If you hugged her now, Brenda says, all you'd feel is the pointy wire of her bra. Hot potting, she says, is you get a gang of kids together and you hike up the fault line of the White River. You pack in your own beer and whiskey and you find a hot springs pool. Most of these pools, they stand between 150 and 200 degrees year-round up at this elevation. Water boils at 198 degrees Fahrenheit. Even in winter, at the bottom of a deep icy pit, the steep sides of snowdrifts sloping into them, these pools are hot enough to boil you alive. No, the big danger up here wasn't bears not here. You won't see wolves or coyote or bobcat. Downriver, yeah. Just one click away on your odometer, just one radio song down the highway. The motels, they have to chain their garbage cans shut. Down there, the snow is busy with paw prints. The night is noisy with packs howling at the moon, but here, the snow is smooth. Here, even the full moon is quiet. Upriver from the lodge, all you had to worry about was being scalded to death. City kids, dropped out of college, some stay around for a couple years. Some way they pass down the okay about which pools are safe and where to find them, and where not to walk, where there's only a thin crust of calcium or limestone cinder that looks like bedrock, but will drop you through to deep fry in a hidden thermal vent. The scare stories these kids pass along. 100 years back, a Mrs. Lester Bannock, here visiting from Crystal Falls, Pennsylvania. She stopped to wipe the steam from her smoked glasses. The breeze shifted, blowing hot steam in her eyes. One wrong step and she was off the path. Another wrong step and she lost her balance, landing backward, sitting in the water, scalding hot. Trying to stand, she pitched forward, landing face down in the water, screaming she was hauled out by strangers. The sheriff who raced her into town, he requisitioned every drop of olive oil from the kitchen at the lodge. Coated in olive oil and wrapped in clean sheets, Mrs. Lester Bannock died in a hospital, still screaming 3 days later. Recent as 2 summers ago, some kid from Park City, Wyoming, this kid, he parked his pickup truck and out jumped his German Shepherd. The dog splashed dead center, jumping into a pool, and it yelped itself to death mid-dog paddle. The tourists, chewing their knuckles, they told the kid, don't, but he still dove in. He surfaced just one time, his eyeballs boiled white and staring, rolling around blind. Nobody could touch him long enough to grab hold, and then he was gone. The rest of that year, they dipped him out with nets, the way you'd clean leaves and dead bugs out of a swimming pool, the way you'd skim the fat off a pot of stew. At the lodge bar, Brenda, she'll pause to let people see this moment in their heads. The bits of this kid left all summer skittering around in the hot water like a batch of fritters spitting to a light brown. Brenda would smoke her cigarette for a little bit. Then like this is something that she's just remember, Brenda will say, Olson Reed, and she'll laugh. Like this is something that Brenda doesn't think about part of every minute, every hour she's awake. She'll say, you should have met Olson Reed. Big, fat, virtuous, sin-free Olson Reed. Olson was a cook at the lodge, fat and pale white, his lips too big, blown up with blood and squirming red as sushi against the sticky rice-white skin of his face. Olson, he watched those hot pools, the 2 hot springs, the way he'd kneel beside them all day, watching it, the brown, bubbling froth hot as acid. One wrong step, One quick slide down the wrong side of a snowdrift, and just hot water would do to you what Olson did to food all day. Poached salmon, stewed chicken and dumplings, hard-boiled eggs. In the lodge kitchen, Olson, he used to sing hymns so loud you could hear them in the dining room. Olson, huge in his flapping white apron, the ties knotted and cutting into his thick, deep waist. He would sit in the bar reading his Bible in the almost dark, the beer and smoke smell of the dark red carpet. If he joined your table in the break room, Olson would bow his head to his chest and say a rambling blessing over his bologna sandwich. His favorite verb was fellowship. One night when Olson walked into the pantry and found Brenda kissing a bellhop, just some liberal arts dropout from NYU, Olson Reed told them that kissing was the devil's first step to fornication. With his rubbery red lips, Olson told everyone he was saving himself for marriage, but the truth was he couldn't give himself away. To Olson Reed, the White River was his Garden of Eden, the proof that his God did beautiful work. Olson watched the hot springs, the geysers, and the steaming mud pots, the way that every Christian loves the idea of hell, the way that every Eden has to have its snake. He watched the scalding water steam and spit, the same way that he would peek through the order window and watch the waitresses in the dining room. On his day off, he would carry his Bible through the woods, through the clouds and fog of sulfur. He would be singing Amazing Grace or Nearer My God to Thee, but only the 5th or 6th verses, the parts so strange and unknown that you might think he made them up. Walking on that center, that thin crust of calcium that forms the way that ice sets up on water, Olson would step off the boardwalk and he would kneel at the deep edge of a spitting, stinking pool. And kneeling there, he would pray out loud for Brenda and the bellhop. He would pray to his Lord, our God Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. He'd pray for the immortal soul of each busboy by name. He would inventory the sins of each hotel mate out loud. Olson's voice rising with esteem, he prayed for Lisa, who pinned up the hem of her skirt too high and who committed the act of oral sex with any hotel guest willing to cut loose with $20. The tourist family standing back, safe on the boardwalk behind him, Olson begged for mercy for the dining room waiters, Evan and Leo, who assaulted each other with lewd acts of sodomy every night in the men's dorm. Olson wept and shouted about Dewey and Buddy, who breathed glue from a brown paper bag while they washed the dishes. There, kneeling there at the gates of his hell, Olson yelled opinions into the trees in the sky, making his report to God. Olson walked out after the dinner shift, and he shouted your sins at the stars so bright they bled together in the night. Olson begged for God's mercy on your behalf. No, nobody very much liked Olson Reed. Nobody any age likes a tattletale. We'd all heard the stories about the woman wrapped in olive oil, the kid cooked to soup with his dog. But Olson especially would listen, his eyes bright as candy, because this was proof of everything he held dear. The truth of this, the proof that you can't hide what you've done from God, you can't fix it. We would be alive and awake in hell, but we would be hurting so bad that we would wish we could die. And we would spend all eternity suffering someplace that no one in the world would trade us to be. Here it would be that Brenda would stop talking. She would light a new cigarette. She would draw you another beer maybe. some stories, she'd say, the more you tell them, the faster you can use them up. Those kind of stories, the drama burns off in every version. They sound more silly and flat. But the other kind of stories, they use you up. The more you tell those kind, the stronger they get. Those kind of stories, they only serve to remind you how stupid you were, you are, will always be. Telling some kind of stories, Brenda says, is the same as committing suicide. It's here that she works really hard to make her story boring, saying how water heated to 158 degrees Fahrenheit causes third-degree burns in 1 second. The typical thermal feature along the White River Fault is a vent that opens to a pool crusted around the edge with a layer of crystallized mineral. The average temperature of thermal features along the White River is 205 degrees Fahrenheit. 1 second in water this hot, and pulling your socks off will pull off your feet. The cooked skin of your hands will stick to anything you touch and stay there, perfect as a pair of leather gloves. Your body will try to save itself by shifting fluids to the burn to dissipate the heat. Then you'll sweat, dehydrating faster than the worst case of diarrhea. Losing so much fluid, your blood pressure drops, you go into shock. Then your vital organs will shut down in rapid succession. Those kind of burns can be first degree, second, third, or fourth degree. They can be superficial, partial thickness, or full thickness burns. In superficial or first degree burns, the skin turns red without blistering. Think of a sunburn and the subsequent desquamation of necrotic tissue, the dead skin peeling. In full thickness, third degree burns, you get that dry white leather look of a knuckle that bumps the top heating element when you take a cake out of the oven. In fourth degree burns, you are cooked worse than skin deep. To determine the extent of a burn, the medical examiner will use what they call the rule of nines. Your head is 9% of your body's total skin. Each arm is 9%. Each leg is 18%. Your torso, the front and back, are each 18%. 1% for your neck, and you get the whole 100%. It's poetry to hear Brenda spin this out. Skeletonization, skin slippage, hypokalemia. Those long words that will take everybody in the bar to say far-off abstracts far, far away. It's a nice little break in her story before we face the worst. You can spend your whole life building a wall of facts between you and anything real. A January like this, most of her lifetime ago, Brenda and Olson, the cook, they were the only people in the lodge that night. The day before had dropped about 3 feet of new snow, and the plows hadn't come through yet. The same as every night, Olson Reed takes his Bible in one fat hand, and he goes tramping off into the snow. Back then, they did have coyotes to worry about, cougar and bobcat. Singing Amazing Grace for a mile, never repeating a verse, Olson Reed tramps off white against the white snow. The 2 lanes of Highway 17 lost under the snow, the neon sign saying "The Lodge" in green neon. The outside world, like every night, is just moonlight, black and blue, the forest just dark pine tree shapes stretched up. Back then, young and thin, Brenda never gave Olson a second thought. She never realized how long he was gone until she heard the wolves start to howl. She was looking at her teeth, holding a polished butter knife so she could see how straight and white her teeth looked. She was used to hearing Olson shout each night, his voice shouting her name followed by a sin, real or make-believe, the way it came from the woods. She smoked cigarettes, Olson shouted. She slow danced. Olson screamed at God on her behalf. telling the story now, she'll make you tweeze the rest of it out of her. The idea of her trapped here, her soul in limbo. Nobody comes to the lodge planning to stay here for the rest of their life. Hell, Brenda says, there are things that you can see happen that are worse than getting killed. There's things that happen worse than a car accident that can leave you stranded, worse than breaking an axle. When you're young and you're left tending bar in some little no place for the rest of your life. More than half her life ago, Brenda hears the wolves start to howl, the coyotes yip. She hears Olson screaming, not her name or any sin, but just screaming. She goes to the dining room side doorway. She steps outside, leaning out over the snow, and she turns her head sideways to listen. She smells Olson before she can see him. It's that smell of breakfast, of bacon frying in cold air, the smell of bacon or Spam sliced thick and hissing crisp in its own hot fat. At this point in her story, the electric wall heater always comes on. That moment, the moment the room's got as cold as it's gonna get, Brenda, she knows that moment. She can feel it make the hair stand up on her top lip. She knows when to stop for a second, to leave a little way of quiet, and then boom, the rush and the wail of the warm air out of the heater. The fan makes a low moan, far away at first, then close up loud. Brenda makes sure that the bar's dark by now. The heater comes on, the low moan of it, and people look up, and all they can see in the window is their own reflection, their own face not recognized. Looking inside at them is just a pale mask full of dark holes. The mouth is hanging open, dark hole. Their own eyes too close together, staring black holes through to the night behind them. At this point, their car is parked just outside. They look 100 cold miles away. Even the parking lot looks too far to walk in this kind of dark. The face of Olson Reed when she found him, his neck and his head, this last 10% of him was still perfect, beautiful even, compared to the peeling, boiled food rest of his body, still screaming, as if the stars could give a shit. Something left of Olson Reed was dragging itself down this side of the White River. It stumbled, knees wobbling, staggering, and coming apart. There were parts of Olson already gone. His legs below his knees cooked and drug off over the broken ice, bit and pulled off, the skin first and then the bones, the blood so cooked inside them, there's nothing going off behind him but a trail of his own grease, his heat melting deep into the snow. That kid from Park City, Wyoming, the kid who jumped in to save his dog. Folks say that when the crowd finally pulled him out, his arms popped apart, joint by joint, but he was still alive. His scalp, it peeled back off his white skull, but he was still awake. The surface of that seething water, it spit hot and sparkling rainbow colors from the kid's rendered fat, the grease of him floating on the surface. The kid's dog boiled down to a perfect dog-shaped fur coat, its bones already cooked clean and settling into the deep geothermal center of the world. The kid's last words were, "I fucked up. I can't fix this, can I?" That's how Brenda found Olson Reed that night. But worse. The snow behind him, the fresh powder all around him, it was cut with drool. All around his screams fanned out around him Brenda could see a crowd of yellow eyes, the snow stamped down to ice in the prints of coyote feet, the four-toe prints of wolf paws. Floating around him were the long skull faces of wild dogs, panting behind their own white breath, their black lips curled up along the ridge of each snout. Their little root teeth meshed together tight, tugging back on the rags of Olson's white pants, the shredded pant legs still steaming from what's boiled alive inside. That next heartbeat, the yellow eyes are gone, and what's left of Olson is what's left. Snow is still kicked up by back feet. It sparkles in the air. The two of them in the warm cloud of bacon smell. Olson pulsed with heat. A big baked potato sinking deeper into the snow beside her. His skin was crusted now, puckering and rough as fried chicken, but loose and slippery on top of the muscle underneath, the muscle twisting cooked around the core of warm bone. His hands clamped tight around her, around Brenda's fingers, and when she tried to pull away, his skin tore. His cooked hands stuck the way your lips freeze to a flagpole on the playground in cold weather. And when she tried to pull away, his fingers split to the bone, baked and bloodless inside. And he screamed and gripped tight. He was too heavy to move, sunk there in the snow. And she was anchored there, the side door to the dining room, only 20 footprints away in the snow. The door was still open, and the tables inside set for the next meal. Brenda could see the dining room's big stone mountain of a fireplace, the logs burning inside. She could watch, but it was too far away to feel. She swam with her feet, kicking, trying to drag Olson, but the snow was just too deep. Instead of moving, she stayed. She stayed hoping that he would die, praying to God to kill Olson Reed before she froze. The wolves watching with their yellow eyes from the dark edge of the forest, the pine tree shapes going up into the night sky, the stars above them bleeding together. That night, Olson told her a story, his own private ghost story. When we die, these are the stories still on our lips, the stories that we'll only tell to strangers someplace private in the padded cell of midnight. These important stories, we rehearse them for years in our head, but we never tell them. These stories are ghosts, bringing people back from the dead just for a moment, for a visit. Every story is a ghost, and this story is Olson's. Melting snow in her mouth, Brenda would spit the water into Olson's fat red lips, his face the only part of him that she could touch without getting stuck. Kneeling there beside him, the devil's first step to fornication, that kiss, the moment that Olson had saved himself for. For most of her life, Brenda never told anybody what he yelled. Holding this inside was such a burden. Now she tells everybody, but it's no better. That boiled, sad thing up the White River, it screamed, "Why did God do this to me?" It screamed, "God, what did I do?" Timberwolves, Brenda says, and she laughs. We don't have that trouble. Not here, she says, not anymore. How Olson died, it's called myoglobularium. In extensive burns, the burned muscles release the protein myoglobulin. This flood of protein into the bloodstream overwhelms each kidney. The kidneys shut down and the body fills with fluid and blood toxins, renal failure, myoglobinuria. Then, when Brenda says these words, she could be a magician doing a trick. They could be a spell and an incantation. But this way to die takes all night. The next morning, the snowplow came through. The driver found them, Olson Reed dead and Brenda asleep. From melting snow in her mouth all night, her gums were patched with white. frostbite. Reed's dead hands were still locked around hers, protecting her fingers, warm as a pair of gloves. For weeks, the frozen skin around the base of each tooth, it peeled away soft and gray from the brown root until the way Brenda's teeth looked the way they do now, until Brenda's lips were gone. Desquamating necrotic tissue, another magic spell. No. There is nothing out there in those woods. Brenda will tell people, there's nothing evil. It is just something so sad and alone. It's Olson Reed not knowing still what he did wrong, not knowing where he's at. So terrible and alone, even the wolves, the coyotes, they're gone from up that end of the White River. That's how a scary story works. It echoes some ancient fear. It recreates some forgotten terror, something we'd like to think that we have grown beyond, but it can still scare us to tears. It's always something that we had hoped was maybe healed by this point. Every night is scattered with them, these wandering people who can't be saved, but who just won't die. You can hear them at night screaming out there up this side of the White River Fault. Some January nights, there's still that smell of hot grease, crisp bacon. Olson Reed not feeling his legs but still getting tugged back, him screaming, his fingers hooked claws in the snow, getting tugged back into the dark by all those clenched little teeth. That's hot potting. Thank you. Now, I would very much like to thank the festival for inviting me. It took really moving heaven and earth to make this happen in the middle of what is a pretty humongous book tour. So I appreciate being invited, and I appreciate what it took to get me here. And I appreciate what it took to get you here. So thank you very much. And I will be out there for a while, but let's hope that maybe we can do a little quickie encore in a little bit. If you've got the guts for it. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you, Chuck. Before we close, I want to recognize one more person on our team, radio producer and personality, Lenny Holloman, who produces the Montana Festival of the Book Series on Montana and Yellowstone Public Radio. Lenny, come out and take a bow. Lenny is the voice that the festival, most people recognize. All three of our writers will be in the lobby shortly for conversation and signings. Next year's Montana Festival of the Book is scheduled for September 16th and 17th, 2005. We look forward to seeing you then. We're at a conclusion tonight. Thank you for coming and good evening.